The sun hung low over the prairie, casting long shadows across the dry, cracked earth of Ethan Carter's farm. It had been a hard year, too little rain, too much wind, and a loneliness that dug deeper than the roots of his failing crops. 3 years had passed since fever took his wife, Mary, leaving him with nothing but a grieving heart and a young son to raise alone. Jack was only 6 when his mother died, and now, at 9, he had grown quiet, his laughter as scarce as the harvest. Ethan wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, his calloused fingers rough against his skin. The cornstalks stood weak and stunted, their leaves curling at the edges like paper left too long in the sun. He knew, without saying it aloud, that this year would not be enough. The bank in town had already sent word one more poor season, and the land his father had worked before him would be lost. Inside the small, weathered farmhouse, Jack sat at the wooden table, tracing his finger along a crack in the surface. A single candle flickered, its light too thin to push back the evening gloom. Ethan had tried to teach the boy to read, but without Mary's patience, the lessons never lasted long. Instead, Jack spent his days wandering the fields, talking to the horses, as if they could understand him. That night, as the wind whispered through the gaps in the walls, Ethan knelt beside his bed, the floorboards creaking under his weight. He wasn't a man of many words, not even in prayer, but he closed his eyes and whispered, "Lord, I don't know how much longer I can do this alone." The next morning, with the last of their flour packed into a sack and a few coins in his pocket, Ethan hitched the old wagon and set out for town. Jack rode beside him, his feet swinging above the floorboards, his eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for something or someone to fill the quiet. The town of Cedar Ridge wasn't much, a handful of buildings clinging to the edge of civilization. The general store stood beside the blacksmith shop, and beyond that, the train station, where folks came and went like shadows passing through. Ethan left Jack with the horses and stepped inside the store, the bell above the door jingling softly. The shopkeeper, a wiry man named Mr. Higgins, nodded as Ethan set his meager purchases on the counter. "Heard the bank's been pressing folks lately," Higgins said, his voice low. "You holdin' up?" Ethan only grunted in reply, counting out the coins with care. There was no use talking about what couldn't be changed. As he stepped back outside, the sound of crying caught his ear. Near the train station, a woman sat on a wooden bench, her shoulders shaking. Her dress was travel-worn, her gloves clutched tight in her hands. A carpet bag rested at her feet, its straps frayed at the edges. Ethan hesitated. He had enough troubles of his own, but something, maybe the way she hunched over, as if trying to disappear, made him walk toward her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough from disuse. She looked up, her eyes red and swollen. Her face was round and soft, her cheeks streaked with tears. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "He left me." Ethan frowned. "Who did?" "The man who was supposed to marry me." She swallowed hard, her fingers twisting the fabric of her skirt. "He took one look at me and said I was too fat to be his wife. Then he got back on the train and left." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and cruel. Ethan didn't know what to say. He glanced back at Jack, who was watching them with wide, curious eyes. Then he looked at the woman again, stranded, alone, with nowhere to go. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle blew, lonely and long. Ethan took a deep breath. "You got a name, ma'am?" She wiped her eyes. "Rose." He nodded, then made up his mind. "Well, Rose, it's a long ride back to my farm, and it'll be dark soon. You're welcome to stay the night if you've got nowhere else." Rose stared at him, as if waiting for the trick, the catch. But Ethan's face was steady, his offer plain and simple. And so, as the first stars blinked to life overhead, Ethan Carter helped a stranger into his wagon, unaware that this single act of kindness would change everything. The wagon wheels groaned against the hard-packed dirt of the road as Ethan guided the horses homeward, the rhythmic creaking the only sound for miles. Rose sat stiffly beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the horizon, as if afraid to meet his eyes. Jack, perched in the back among the sacks of flour and sugar, studied her with the unguarded curiosity of a child, his earlier shyness giving way to fascination. A cool evening breeze stirred the tall grass lining the path, carrying the scent of sun-warmed earth and distant rain. Rose shivered slightly. Though the air was not yet cold, her trembling came from something deeper, the kind of hurt that settles in the bones. Ethan stole a glance at her, noting the way her fingers worried the fabric of her skirt, the way her breath hitched just slightly when she thought no one was listening. He knew that silence. It was the silence of shame. The farm came into view as the last light of day bled from the sky, a modest house with a sagging porch, a barn whose paint had long since peeled away, and fields that stretched wearily into the gathering dark. It wasn't much, but it was home. Ethan pulled a wagon to a stop near the porch and hopped down, his boots kicking up little puffs of dust. Without a word, he reached up to help Rose, his hand steady under her elbow as she stepped down. She hesitated for the briefest moment before accepting, her touch light and uncertain, as if she feared being a burden. Jack scrambled from the wagon, his energy undimmed by the long ride. "Pa, can I show her the chickens?" he asked, bouncing on his toes. Ethan shook his head. "Not now, son. It's near dark, and they're already roosting." Rose offered Jack a small, tired smile. "Maybe tomorrow," she said softly, and the boy beamed as if she'd promised him the moon. Inside, the house was dim and close, the air thick with the lingering scent of wood smoke and old memories. Ethan lit a lantern, its golden glow pushing back the shadows, revealing the worn but sturdy furniture. The hearth swept clean, the few dishes stacked neatly on the shelf. It was clear a woman hadn't lived here in years, not from neglect, but from the absence of those small, unspoken touches that make a house a home. Rose stood just inside the doorway, her carpetbag clutched to her chest like a shield. Ethan cleared his throat. "You can set your things in Mary's old room," he said, nodding toward the narrow hallway. "It's not much, but it's clean." At the mention of his late wife, Rose's eyes flickered with understanding. "I don't want to intrude," she murmured. Ethan shook his head. "Ain't intruding if you're invited." Jack, ever eager, tugged at Rose's sleeve. "I'll show you," he declared, and before she could protest, he was leading her down the hall to the small bedroom at the end. Ethan busied himself building up the fire, the crackle of kindling filling the quiet. He could hear Jack chattering away, his voice bright with excitement, and Rose's quieter replies, warm despite their weariness. It struck him then how long it had been since another woman's voice had filled these walls. When Rose returned to the main room, her posture had softened slightly, though her hands still twisted together nervously. "I can fix supper," she offered, glancing toward the stove. "Least I can do for your kindness." Ethan hesitated. He wasn't used to being tended to not since Mary, and the thought of someone else working in his kitchen felt strange, almost like a betrayal. But the hopeful look in Rose's eyes made him nod. "Reckon that'd be welcome," he said. As Rose moved about the kitchen, her hands quick and capable despite her unfamiliarity with the space, Ethan settled into his chair, watching. There was a quiet grace to her movements, a steadiness that belied the tears she'd shed earlier. She hummed under her breath as she worked, a tuneless little sound, as if she didn't even realize she was doing it. Jack, seated at the table, rested his chin in his hands, watching Rose with rapt attention. "You cook a lot where you're from?" he asked. Rose paused, her back to them for a moment before she answered. "I did," she said simply, and something in her voice told Ethan there was more to that story, but he didn't press. The smell of frying potatoes and onions soon filled the room, rich and comforting. Ethan hadn't realized how hungry he was until his stomach growled loudly, earning a giggle from Jack. Rose glanced over her shoulder, and for the first time since he'd met her, her lips curled into a genuine, if hesitant, smile. When the food was ready, they ate in companionable silence, the only sounds the scrape of forks against plates and the occasional chirp of a cricket outside the window. Rose kept her eyes down, but Ethan noticed she ate with quiet appreciation, her shoulders relaxing slightly with each bite. After supper, Jack yawned widely, his eyelids drooping. Ethan sent him off to bed with a gentle pat on the shoulder, then turned to Rose, who was already gathering the dishes. "You don't have to do that," he said. Rose shook her head. "I want to." They worked side by side in silence, Ethan drying the plate she washed. The lantern light flickered across her face, softening the edges of her weariness. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice low. "That fella who left you, he's a fool." Rose's hands stilled in the wash basin. She didn't look up, but Ethan saw the way her breath caught. "He wasn't wrong," she whispered. I'm not the kind of woman men want." Ethan set the plate down carefully. "Men can be mighty stupid," he said bluntly. "Ain't about what's on the outside. It's what's in here that counts." He tapped his chest. Rose lifted her gaze then, her eyes searching his face, as if looking for some hint of mockery. Finding none, she exhaled shakily. "You're a good man, Ethan Carter." He shrugged, suddenly uncomfortable under her scrutiny. "Just speaking truth." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters gently. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, its mournful cry echoing across the empty fields. Rose dried her hands on her apron and folded it neatly over the back of a chair. "I'll be gone in the morning," she said quietly. "I won't trouble you further." Ethan frowned. "Where are you gonna go?" She lifted one shoulder in a shrug. "Don't know, but I'll figure something." Ethan studied her for a long moment, taking in the stubborn set of her jaw, the quiet dignity in her bearing. He thought of Jack's bright smile at supper, of the way the house had felt just a little less empty with her in it. "You're welcome to stay," he said at last. "Long as you need." Rose's eyes widened slightly, but before she could respond, a small voice piped up from the hallway. "Please stay." Jack stood there in his nightshirt, his hair tousled from sleep, his expression hopeful. "Just for a little while?" Rose looked from Jack to Ethan, her throat working. For a moment, Ethan thought she might refuse. Then, slowly, she nodded. "All right," she whispered. "Just for a little while." And with those words, something shifted in the air between them, something fragile and unspoken, but they're all the same. Outside, the stars burned bright in the vast, endless sky. The first light of dawn crept through the threadbare curtains of Mary's old room, painting the walls in pale gold as Rose stirred beneath the quilt. For a moment, she lay still, blinking at the unfamiliar ceiling, the events of the previous day settling over her like a heavy cloak. The train station, the cruel words, the kindness of a stranger. She pressed her palms against her eyes, as if she could push back the memory of that humiliating moment when she'd realized she'd been discarded like a piece of unwanted baggage. A rooster crowed outside, its sharp cries slicing through the morning quiet. Rose sat up, her fingers tracing the neat stitches of the quilt Mary's quilt. She realized with a pang. She wondered what the woman who had once slept in this bed had been like. Kind, surely, to have earned the loyalty of a man like Ethan and the love of a boy like Jack. The thought made her own loneliness feel even heavier. She dressed quickly, smoothing her rumpled travel dress as best she could, then hesitated at the door. What if Ethan regretted his offer? What if he'd only taken pity on her and now wished her gone? The uncertainty coiled tight in her stomach, but she squared her shoulders and stepped into the hallway. The main room was empty, the fire in the hearth reduced to glowing embers. The table had been wiped clean, and a single plate sat waiting, a cloth draped over it to keep the food warm. Rose lifted the corner and found a biscuit and a slice of ham, carefully set aside. Her throat tightened. No one had ever left food for her before. She ate quickly, then set to work. She couldn't repay Ethan's kindness with idleness. The kitchen was tidy but dusty, the shelves in need of a thorough scrubbing. She filled a basin with water from the pump outside, rolling up her sleeves as she set to work. The cool water soothed her hands, and the rhythmic motion of wiping, scrubbing, polishing gave her mind something to focus on besides the gnawing fear of what came next. She was elbow-deep in soapy water when the door creaked open. Jack stood there, his hair sticking up in all directions, his eyes bright with curiosity. You're still here, he said, as if he'd half expected her to vanish in the night. Rose smiled despite herself. I am. Jack shuffled closer, peering into the basin. Pa says you're gonna stay a while. Rose's hand stilled. Did he? Jack nodded solemnly. He said it at breakfast. Said you might need help, and we got plenty of room. He paused, then added, I'm glad you're here. It gets awful quiet sometimes. Rose's chest ached at the honesty in his voice. She knew that kind of quiet, the kind that pressed in on you until it felt like you might suffocate. Well, she said softly, I suppose I could stay for a bit, if you'll have me. Jack grinned, his whole face lighting up. Can you make apple pie? Ma used to, but Pa burns it every time. Rose laughed, the sound surprising her. I can try. The morning passed in a blur of activity. Jack showed her around the farm, the chicken coop with its clucking hens, the garden patch gone wild with weeds, the old mare who nuzzled Rose's palm in search of treats. The boy talked endlessly, his words tumbling out as if he'd been saving them up for years. Rose listened, nodding in all the right places, her heart softening at his eagerness. Ethan appeared at midday, his shirt damp with sweat, his boots caked in dirt. He paused when he saw Rose kneeling in the garden, her hands black with soil as she wrestled with a stubborn tangle of weeds. You don't have to do that, he said, his voice gruff. Rose sat back on her heels, wiping her forehead with the back of her wrist. I know. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, an understanding, perhaps, that they were both people who needed to keep their hands busy to quiet their minds. Ethan nodded once, then turned to Jack. Come on, boy. Those fence posts won't mend themselves. As the day wore on, Rose found herself falling into an easy rhythm. She swept the porch, beat the dust from the rugs, even attempted to patch a tear in Jack's shirt with clumsy stitches. The work was hard but satisfying, the kind of labor that left her muscles pleasantly sore and her mind blessedly empty. That evening, as she stirred a pot of stew over the fire, Ethan came in from the fields, his face weary but his step lighter than it had been the night before. He paused in the doorway, watching her for a moment before speaking. Smells good. Rose glanced up, startled. It's nothing fancy. Just what I could find in the pantry. Ethan crossed the room, lifting the lid of the pot to peer inside. More than I'd have managed. He hesitated, then added, Preacher's coming by tomorrow. Makes his rounds once a month. Rose's spoon stilled. Oh. Ethan met her gaze steadily. He's a good man. Doesn't hold with gossip or nonsense. Rose understood the unspoken reassurance the preacher wouldn't judge her, wouldn't whisper about the strange woman staying at the Carter farm. She nodded, relief loosening the knot in her chest. After supper, the preacher's visit forgotten in favor of Jack's enthusiastic retelling of his day, Rose found herself smiling more than she had in years. The boys' laughter filled the little house, bouncing off the walls and soaking into the very bones of the place. Even Ethan seemed less guarded, the lines around his eyes softening as he watched his son. When Jack finally yawned and trudged off to bed, the room settled into a comfortable silence. Rose busied herself clearing the table, but Ethan stopped her with a gentle touch on her arm. You've done enough today, he said. Rose looked down at his hand, rough and work-worn against her sleeve. I like keeping busy. Ethan studied her for a long moment. Why'd you come out here? Really? The question caught her off guard. Rose set the plate down carefully, her fingers tracing its edge. I thought it was my last chance. She swallowed hard. Back home, I was just somebody's spinster sister, always in the way. The letters that Miner sent, they made it sound like I could be useful. Like I could belong somewhere. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Guess I was wrong. Ethan was silent for so long that Rose thought he might not respond at all. Then, quietly, he said, Man who can't see your worth ain't worth a second of your time. Rose's breath hitched. No one had ever spoken to her like that, like she was someone of value. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, and the first fat drops of rain began to patter against the roof. Ethan reached for his hat. Best check on the animals before the storm gets worse. Rose nodded, watching as he stepped out into the gathering dark. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving her alone with the echo of his words. For the first time in a long time, she dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, she hadn't reached her last chance after all. The rain came down in earnest as Ethan strode toward the barn, the wind whipping at his coat and the first cold drops slipping beneath his collar. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the farm in jagged bursts of white, and in those brief flashes, he could see the vulnerability of it all: the sagging fence posts, the roof that needed mending, the fields that would either drown or flourish depending on the storm's mercy. He worked quickly, securing the barn door, checking on the mare, making sure the chickens were sheltered. The animals were restless, their eyes wide in the lantern light, sensing the unease that hummed beneath his skin. It wasn't just the storm. Rose's words had settled in his chest like a weight. I thought it was my last chance. He knew that kind of desperation. After Mary died, there had been days when the only thing that kept him moving was Jack's small hand in his, the boy's need greater than his own grief. But Rose had no one. No child to tend. No land to tie her to a place. Just the hope that somewhere, someone might see her as more than what she'd been told she was. A gust of wind nearly tore the lantern from his grip. Cursing, he shielded the flame with his body and turned back toward the house. Through the rain-streaked window, he could see Rose moving inside, her silhouette warm and solid against the flickering firelight. She was washing dishes, her head bowed, her shoulders rounded, as if against an invisible burden. Ethan hesitated on the porch, water pooling at his feet. He didn't know what to do with the feeling swelling in his chest, this strange, protective urge that went beyond mere kindness. It unsettled him. Mary had been gone 3 years, but sometimes it felt like yesterday, the memory of her smile as sharp as a splinter under his skin. Loving someone else felt like a betrayal, even if his heart had long since gone numb. He pushed inside, dripping onto the worn floorboards. Rose turned, her hands still wet from the basin, her eyes widening at the sight of him. "You're soaked through," she said, and before he could protest, she was pressing a towel into his hands. Ethan took it, their fingers brushing briefly. "Storm's getting worse," he muttered, rubbing the rough fabric over his face. "Might flood the lower field if it keeps up." Rose glanced toward the window, where the rain lashed against the glass. "Will the crops be all right?" Ethan shrugged. "Either they will or they won't." Farming was like that, a gamble with the earth and the sky, and a man was just a bystander to it all. Rose hesitated, then reached for the kettle. "Let me make you some tea. You're shivering." Ethan didn't argue. He sat at the table, watching as she moved around the kitchen with a quiet efficiency that was starting to feel familiar. The way she tested the heat of the kettle with her fingertips, the way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear without thinking, little things that shouldn't have mattered, but somehow did. Jack's voice piped up from the hallway. "Pa? Is the roof gonna leak again?" Ethan turned to see his son hovering in the doorway, his nightshirt rumpled from sleep. "Might," he admitted. "But we'll set out the buckets if it does." Rose poured the tea, the steam curling in the air between them. "I can help," she said suddenly. "With the farm, I mean. I may not know much about planting, but I can learn." Ethan studied her over the rim of his cup. "Why?" Rose met his gaze, her chin lifting just a fraction. "Because you took me in. Because Jack deserves a better life than struggling just to keep afloat." She paused, then added softly, "Because maybe I need to prove to myself that I'm not useless." The raw honesty of it struck Ethan like a punch to the gut. He'd known hardship, known loss, but he'd never had to question his own worth. The land might fail him, the weather might turn against him, but he'd always known who he was: a farmer, a father, a man who did what needed doing. Rose had been stripped of even that certainty. Outside, the storm raged, the wind howling around the corners of the house like a living thing. Inside, the fire crackled and the tea warmed Ethan's hands, and for the first time in years, the silence between two people didn't feel like emptiness. He set his cup down. "All right," he said simply. Rose blinked. "All right." Ethan nodded. "You want to help? Tomorrow you're with me in the fields. But I warn you, it's hard work." A slow smile spread across Rose's face, brighter than the lightning outside. I'm stronger than I look. Ethan almost smiled back. The next morning dawned clear and cool, the storm having washed the sky clean. Ethan was up before the sun, his boots crunching on the wet grass as he surveyed the damage. The lower field was muddy, but not flooded. The fence posts would need reinforcing, but they'd hold. It could have been worse. Rose joined him as he was repairing a section of the chicken coop, her sleeves rolled up and her hair tied back in a practical knot. She didn't wait for instructions, just picked up a hammer and held it out to him. "Show me what to do." And so he did. Day after day, Rose worked beside him, her hands growing calloused, her skin tanning under the sun. She learned quickly, her movements growing more sure with each passing week. She didn't complain, even when her back ached or her palms blistered. And when Jack trailed after them, asking endless questions, Rose answered with a patience Ethan had never managed. The farm began to change. The garden flourished under Rose's care, rows of vegetables sprouting where, before, there had been only weeds. The house stayed clean, the meals came regular, and Jack's laughter became a constant soundtrack to their days. One evening, as Ethan sat on the porch sharpening his tools, the preacher rode up the lane, his horse's hooves kicking up little clouds of dust. Ethan hadn't forgotten his promise that the man wouldn't bring judgment with him, but he still tensed as the preacher dismounted and tipped his hat. "Evening, Ethan." Ethan nodded. "Preacher." The man's eyes flicked toward the house, where Rose could be seen through the window, kneading dough at the table. "Heard you had a visitor." Ethan's grip tightened on the whetstone. "She's staying on, helping with the farm." The preacher was quiet for a moment, then surprised Ethan by smiling. "Funny how the Lord sends us what we need when we're not even looking." Ethan frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" The preacher just clapped him on the shoulder. "Means you're a lucky man, Ethan Carter. Don't waste it." As the preacher rode away, Ethan stared after him, the words settling into his bones. He looked back at the house, at Rose's figure in the window, and for the first time, he let himself wonder what it might be like if she stayed. Not just for a season. Not just until the harvest. But for good. The thought should have scared him. It didn't. The morning mist clung to the fields like a bridal veil as Ethan stood at the edge of the pasture, his breath visible in the crisp autumn air. In his hands he clutched a small wooden box, its hinges worn smooth from years of handling. Inside lay Mary's wedding ring, a simple silver band that had rested untouched since the day they'd buried her. The metal felt foreign against his calloused fingers now, too light to carry the weight of all it represented. He'd woken before the stars faded, slipping from the house like a thief to walk the property line until his thoughts untangled themselves. 3 months Rose had been with them. 3 months of shared labor and quiet suppers, of Jack's laughter ringing through rooms that had echoed with silence for too long. The preacher's words had taken root in him, growing with each passing day until they could no longer be ignored. A rustle in the tall grass startled him. Jack emerged, his hair sleep-tousled, his boots laced haphazardly. "Pa." The boy's voice still carried the softness of dreams. "Why are you out here with Mama's ring?" Ethan closed the box with a snap. The answer came easier than he expected. "Because it's time to ask Rose to stay." Jack's face lit like the sunrise cresting the eastern ridge. "For always?" The simple faith in those words undid him. Ethan knelt in the dew-damp grass, bringing himself eye level with his son. "You reckon she'd say yes?" Jack didn't hesitate. "She already has. Every time she fixes your shirt buttons without being asked. When she saves the crusty bread ends for you, because she knows you like them." The boy's small hand patted Ethan's stubbled cheek. "You just gotta ask proper, Pa." The truth of it settled over Ethan like a warm blanket. He'd been waiting for a sign, some celestial confirmation that moving forward wasn't betraying the past. But life wasn't lived in grand gestures. It was built in the quiet moments, the shared burdens, the unspoken understandings that grew between people who cared for one another. By the time they returned to the house, Rose already had coffee brewing and flapjacks sizzling on the stove. She turned with a smile that faltered when she saw their solemn faces. "Everything all right?" Ethan set the wooden box on the table with a decisive click. "Rose," he began, then stopped, his throat suddenly tight. 3 months of words unsaid crowded behind his teeth. Jack rolled his eyes and gave his father's leg an encouraging kick. Ethan tried again. "The preacher's coming by tomorrow." He watched confusion flicker across Rose's face. "I'd like him to marry us. If you'll have me." The spatula slipped from Rose's fingers, clattering against the cast iron. Her hands flew to cover her mouth, but not before Ethan saw them tremble. The silence stretched, broken only by the pop of bubbling batter and Jack's poorly contained giggle. Ethan pressed on, the words coming easier now. "I ain't got much to offer. The farm's still in debt, the house needs work, and I'm set in my ways." He opened the box, the silver band catching the morning light. "But what's mine would be yours, including this stubborn boy here." Jack threw his arms around Rose's waist before she could respond. "Please say yes. Pa snores something awful, but you get used to it." Rose's laughter came out half a sob as she stroked Jack's hair. When she lifted her gaze to Ethan's, her eyes shone with tears. "You're sure?" Ethan crossed the room in 2 strides, cradling her work-roughened hands in his. "Never been more sure of anything." The wedding took place at first light the next morning, the preacher's breath fogging in the crisp air as they stood on the porch. Rose wore a simple blue dress borrowed from the neighbor's daughter, her hair braided with wildflowers Jack had picked. Ethan's hands shook as he slid the silver band onto her finger, the metal warmed by his palm. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Jack hooped loud enough to startle the chickens. Rose's kiss was shy but sure, her fingers clinging to Ethan's sleeves as if she feared he might vanish. The rising sun painted them all in gold, etching the moment into memory. As the preacher rode off with a wave and a promise to file the paperwork in town, Ethan studied his wife, with wonder. The ring looked right on her hand, as if it had always belonged there. Jack chattered excitedly about the celebration supper they'd have, already calling Rose Ma, with an ease that made Ethan's chest ache. Rose caught his gaze and smiled, her cheeks pink from more than the morning chill. "What?" Ethan shook his head, unable to put into words the rightness he felt. Instead, he pressed a kiss to her forehead and whispered the truth that had taken him too long to realize. "Welcome home." The farmyard bustled with activity as neighbors arrived bearing dishes and well wishes. The women fussed over Rose while the men clapped Ethan on the back. Children darted between the tables, Jack proudly leading the pack. Laughter and fiddle music spilled across the land, weaving itself into the very soil. As evening fell and the celebration wound down, Ethan found Rose sitting on the porch steps, her face turned toward the first stars. He settled beside her, their shoulders brushing. "Tired?" Rose leaned into him with a contented sigh. "Happy." The word held a world of meaning. Inside, Jack slept soundly, worn out from the day's excitement. The farm stood solid around them, its fields resting until spring. The future stretched ahead, uncertain but no longer lonely. Ethan laced his fingers through Rose's, their wedding bands glinting in the moonlight. No grand promises passed between them, just the quiet understanding that whatever came, they'd face it together. And for the first time in years, that was enough. Winter came howling across the plains, wrapping the Carter farm in a shroud of white that silenced the world and turned the familiar landscape into something strange and new. The first snow found Rose standing at the kitchen window, her palms pressed against the frosted glass as she watched the flakes swirl in dizzying patterns. Back east, winter had been a gray, slushy affair, all muddy streets and damp chill. But here, the cold was clean and sharp, the snow piling in drifts taller than Jack, transforming the farm into a world of glittering stillness. Ethan appeared behind her, his warmth radiating against her back as he settled his hands on her shoulders. "Storm's coming in hard," he murmured, his breath stirring the hair at her temple. "Woodpile's stocked and the animals are settled. We'll be snug as ticks." Rose leaned into him, savoring the solid comfort of his presence. 6 months ago, she'd been a discarded woman with nowhere to go. Now, she had a home, a family, and a ring on her finger that caught the light when she stirred soup or mended socks by the fire. The thought still sent a thrill of wonder through her. A thump from the porch startled them apart. Jack burst in, red-cheeked and snow-crusted, dragging a pine bough nearly as big as himself. "For decorations," he announced, shaking snow everywhere like an overexcited puppy. "Can we string popcorn too? And make ginger cakes?" Mrs. Henderson said that's what proper families do at Christmas. Rose caught Ethan's eye over Jack's head, sharing a silent laugh at the boy's enthusiasm. "I think we can manage that," she said, taking the bough and propping it in a washtub by the hearth. The sharp, clean scent of pine filled the room, mingling with the aromas of simmering stew and fresh bread. As the days grew shorter, the farm became a world unto itself, isolated by the weather, but brimming with warmth. Rose taught Jack how to knead dough until it sprang back under his small fingers, how to dip candles from rendered tallow, how to stitch neat rows on the quilt they were making together. Ethan showed them both how to read the weather in the clouds, how to bank the fire just right to last the night, how to tell if an animal was sick by the look in its eyes. And then, one morning in the deep of winter, Rose woke with a peculiar flutter in her belly, not illness, but something else entirely. She lay still beneath the quilts, counting back the weeks with growing certainty. When she placed Ethan's hand low on her stomach that evening and whispered her suspicion, the look on his face, awe and terror and joy all at once made her heart swell until she thought it might burst. Spring came late that year, the snow reluctant to relinquish its hold on the land. But when the thaw finally arrived, it brought with it a frenzy of activity. Ethan and Jack repaired winter damage to the fences while Rose, her belly rounding beneath her apron, turned the garden soil and planned her plantings. The neighbors came to help with the heavier work, their curious glances at Rose's changing shape tempered by genuine warmth. Mrs. Henderson brought a basket of baby clothes saved from her own children, her eyes soft with memory. "You're glowing, my dear," the older woman said, pressing a hand to Rose's cheek. "Motherhood becomes you." Rose flushed with pleasure, her fingers drifting unconsciously to rest on the curve of her stomach. She'd never imagined this for herself, not the pregnancy, not the way Ethan hovered like a nervous rooster, not the way Jack had taken to whispering secrets to her belly each night. It was more than she'd dared dream of, this simple, ordinary miracle. Summer arrived in a riot of green and gold, the fields flourishing under Ethan's care and the garden spilling over with vegetables Rose had coaxed from the earth. The heat pressed down like a physical weight, but Rose welcomed it, stretching her aching back as she watched clouds of butterflies dance above the wildflowers at the pasture's edge. The pain started at dusk on the last day of July, sharp and regular as clockwork. Rose was shelling peas on the porch when the first real contraction stole her breath. She gripped the armrests of her chair, waiting for it to pass before calling calmly to Ethan, who was repairing a harness in the barnyard. "It's time," she said when he reached her side, sweat already beading on her forehead. Ethan went pale beneath his tan. "Jack," he bellowed, scooping Rose into his arms as if she weighed nothing. "Ride for Mrs. Henderson. Now." The next hours passed in a haze of pain and effort, the farmhouse transformed into a place of primal mystery. Mrs. Henderson arrived in a flurry of competence, shooing Ethan outside despite his protests. Jack was dispatched to the spring house for cold water, then to the garden for rosemary, then anywhere else to keep him from underfoot. Through the open window, Rose could hear Ethan pacing the porch like a caged bear, his boots wearing a path in the boards. When the pain grew unbearable, she bit down on a leather strap and focused on the sound of his restless movement, drawing strength from his nearness even when they were apart. Then, as the first stars pricked through the twilight sky, a new sound joined the chorus of crickets and night birds, a thin, indignant wail that sent a shock of joy through Rose's exhausted body. "A girl," Mrs. Henderson announced, beaming as she wrapped the squalling infant in a soft blanket. "A beautiful, healthy girl." When Ethan was finally allowed in, he approached the bed with the reverence of a man entering a church. His work-roughened finger traced the baby's downy cheek with impossible gentleness. "Lily," he murmured, the name coming to him as naturally as breath. "Like the flowers your mama planted by the porch." Rose's heart clenched at the rightness of it. She looked from Ethan's awestruck face to Jack peering over his father's shoulder with equal parts fascination and alarm, then down at the tiny life in her arms, this perfect being who would never know the loneliness her parents had endured. Outside, fireflies sparked in the gathering dark, their tiny lights mirroring the stars above. The farmhouse glowed like a beacon against the night, warm and alive and full to bursting with love. And in that moment, Rose understood what it meant to be truly, completely home. Years unfolded across the Carter farm like the turning pages of a well-loved book, each season etching its mark upon the land and the family that tended it. The once struggling homestead now thrived, its fields golden with wheat, its fences standing straight and true, its pastures dotted with fat cattle that spoke of prosperity hard-won and well-deserved. The sagging porch had been rebuilt, the roof patched, the walls of the house expanded to accommodate the laughter and chaos of a family that had grown in both number and spirit. Lily, now 5 years old with her mother's bright eyes and her father's stubborn chin, raced through the tall grass with the unrestrained joy of a child who had never known a day without love. Jack, nearly a man at 15 but still boyish in his enthusiasm, trailed behind her, feigning exhaustion as she begged him to play just a little longer. His hands, once small enough to disappear in Ethan's grasp, now bore the beginnings of a man's strength, rough from work, but gentle when they needed to be. Rose stood at the kitchen window, watching them through the glass as she rolled dough for the evening's pie. The late afternoon sun gilded the scene, turning the farm into something out of a dream, a place where hardship had softened into contentment, where loneliness had given way to belonging. Her fingers, dusted with flour, paused as she caught sight of Ethan emerging from the barn, his stride easy and confident in a way it hadn't been all those years ago when she'd first met him. Time had etched new lines at the corners of his eyes, silvered his hair at the temples, but his smile when he spotted her was as warm as it had ever been. He crossed the yard, pausing to scoop Lily into his arms and swing her high, her delighted shrieks carrying on the breeze. Jack said something that made Ethan throw his head back in laughter, the sound rich and full, and Rose's heart swelled with a quiet, fierce pride. She had done this. Not alone, no, but she had been part of the making of this happiness. The screen door creaked open, and Ethan stepped inside, the scent of sun-warmed earth and hay clinging to his clothes. He pressed a kiss to the top of Rose's head, his hand lingering at the small of her back. "Smells good in here," he murmured. "Apple," she replied, nodding toward the basket of fruit Jack had picked that morning. "Your favorite." Ethan's gaze softened. He didn't need to say what they both knew, that it had always been more than the pie. It was the care she put into it, the way she remembered the little things, the way she had woven herself into the fabric of their lives until it was impossible to imagine a time before her. Outside, Lily's voice piped up, demanding her father's attention once more. Ethan sighed, but his eyes were bright as he turned back toward the door. "Duty calls," he said wryly. Rose watched him go, her hands returning to their work, her movements automatic after years of practice. The dough was smooth beneath her fingers, pliant and yielding. It was a small thing, making a pie, but it was hers. Just as the farm was hers, and the family was hers, and this life, this beautiful, ordinary, extraordinary life was hers. She had arrived at this place a stranger, unwanted and uncertain. Now, she was as much a part of the land as the crops in the fields or the roots of the old oak that shaded the house. She was Rose Carter. Wife. Mother. Home. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, she knew with unshakable certainty that this was only the beginning. Did this story capture your heart? If you loved following Ethan and Rose's journey from loneliness to love, from struggle to triumph, make sure to subscribe for more heartfelt tales of second chances, resilience, and the kind of love that builds families from the ground up. Every subscription helps bring more stories like this to life, stories of ordinary people finding extraordinary happiness against all odds. Don't miss the next adventure. Hit subscribe now. And if this tale stayed with you, leave a comment below. We'd love to hear which moment touched you most. Your support fuels the next chapter, the next story, the next dream waiting to be told. Thank you for reading. Until the next story begins,